Good afternoon. My name is Bud Haedike, and I'm here today to talk to you about World War II and the B-17, Flying Fortress, its crew, and what we did during the war. It's amazing, I looked at my log today, and 76 years ago today, I bombed Ansbach, Germany. I mean, it's amazing right to the day, but that was a long time ago. Actually, I'm more so here to talk about the 8th Air Force, and that was stationed, they called it in East Anglia, England, in which I was a member of the 452nd Bomb Group, 730th Squadron. I speak in schools most of the time, high schools, and I tell children I'm not here to glorify war, but more so to let you know the price that was paid by many young men during World War II. The 8th Air Force, by the way, had the highest casualty rate of anything in World War II. I didn't know that until a few years ago. That means the number of men versus how many died. There were between 28 and 29,000 fellas that went down in their planes and died during World War II. Most of these young men were only 19, 20, maybe 24. I always thought about it, but much more now. They didn't get to be fathers. They didn't get to be grandfathers like me, and it's a sad thing, but again, it was a very hazardous profession. This poster here shows the 8th Air Force, and this is England. Right down here is London, England, and this is known as East Anglia, and it still is today. There were 40, not 20, not 10, but 40 World War II bomber bases in this area. In fact, 10 miles from where I was Jimmy Stewart in Old Buckingham. On this side of England were the fighter bases. And this, of course, is the North Sea and the English Channel, and I crossed that 26 times. There were 12,731 B-17s manufactured by the United States. 12,731. Over 5,000 B-17s, probably closer to 6,000, were shot down. And that equates to about a 40% casualty rate. We carried 100 to 120 octane gasoline, which is very, very expensive. And that's why today we're still paying for it, probably. The fuel capacity, and when I speak in schools, I ask the kids, you want to guess how many gallons of gas we carried in the B-17? And their guesses are all over the place. We carried 2,400 to 2,800 gallons of gas. Now think about that. Your car today carries 15 to 20 gallons of gas. We would burn 50 gallons of gas per hour per engine, or 200 gallons an hour. That's a lot of gasoline. It had four Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder engines. Each one had 12,000 horsepower. Another question I asked children in school, how fast do you think we went? And most of them say 200-300. They were born in the jet age. We would fly at about 155 miles an hour with a bomb load. Once we dropped the bombs, we would probably hit 180, thereabouts, somewhere in there. The B-17, I was told, could go about 300 in the dive, which you did not want to do. The B-17, of course, was not made for speed. It was made for destruction. The range was, I can't read this, the range was 3,000 miles, and we could go as high as 35,000 feet. I never went that high. I got about 31,000 once, and we got lost. Our bomb load was about 6,000 to 8,000 pounds of bombs. The B-24 Liberator, which was the other heavy bomber in World War II, was larger, could carry more bombs, and heavier weight. But of course, we're a little prejudiced. It's like Ford and Chevrolet. The B-24 could not take the punishment the B-17 took, and that has been substantiated many, many times. We would carry 100-pound, 250, 500, or 1,000-pound bombs. We would never, ever mix the bombs. I personally, on my plane, which was my job, dropped 421 bombs weighing 126,200 pounds. Can you even comprehend hundreds and hundreds of bombers? How many tons of bombs were dropped on Germany? When the war ended May 8th, Germany was in total ruins. It was like the World Trade Center, flattened the whole city. And unfortunately, many, many people died. But on a documentary that I happened to be on called The Cold Blue, one of the men in there says, better them than us. And we had to do it to end the war, to beat Hitler. We would bomb railroad yards, submarine pens up by the Baltic Sea, production factories, airfields, oil refineries. That's about it. And at the end, we dropped on the center of town. Can you even think of dropping, or bombs being dropped on the center of St. Louis? In late '44, Winston Churchill and Eisenhower and the powers to be decided to go away from precision bombing, meaning hitting the arch in St. Louis or hitting the Empire State Building in New York, and we went to pattern bombing. What is pattern bombing? I would watch the lead ship in my squadron as well as other planes, and when that ship opened his bomb bay doors, I would open mine. When I saw his first bomb come out, I would release mine. In other words, tons and tons and tons of bombs dropping on the center of the city to knock out electricity, to knock out water, to do whatever we could. The sad part about this was hundreds and hundreds of people died. But because of the B-17, and I've heard this said many times, the war ended about a year sooner. And that was a great thing because it definitely saved American lives. The positions on the B-17, I'll try to point them out, and if you can stick with that. In the nose was the navigator and the Bombardier or Togglier, and that's where I flew. Then you had the pilot and the co-pilot. Then back here you had the flight engineer, and he fired the top turret. Then here was the radio man, and that's the guy with the codes and stuff. Underneath was the ball turret. I happened to fly in there about 6 times. Typical Army or whatever, our ball turret gunner had a bad back, so he asked for help whenever he could get it. Some B-17s had 2 waist gunners, one on either side. In our case, we had 1. A lot of guys, we were a replacement crew, meaning we replaced a crew that didn't make it. We had 1 waist gunner and then the tail gunner. And those were the 9 men in the crew. We would shoot 50 caliber machine guns. I'm looking for it right here. And this was a pretty powerful machine gun. That's what came out. And the B-17 carried 13 50 caliber machine guns. And much later, after the war, I got thinking about that. Think about a German Messerschmitt attacking a group of B-17s, each B-17 having 13 50 caliber machine guns. This took an awful lot of guts. He flew into some terrific firepower, and that's why the German Air Force was decimated long before the war ended. I want to talk to you a little bit here about the equipment. I happen to be fortunate enough to have this equipment, and as I mentioned, 76 years ago today, I was on a mission. But about 75 years, I was, 75, I was back home, and when I got to Union Station in Chicago, I called my dad and asked him to come down to the station. I don't know why I did. And at that time, we had to turn in everything. The infantry had to turn in their rifles. I still don't know really why, other than maybe some mental effect. I gave all this stuff to my dad to take home. I happen to be one of the few, if only. I've never met anybody that has all this equipment. In fact, the 8th Air Force borrowed this, oh my goodness, some 20, 30 years ago to put on a mannequin at one of their reunions. This is the Mae West. Now, why do we call it the Mae West? Because in those days there was a voluptuous movie star named Mae West, and somebody got the idea of naming this after her. But guys say, why? You bombed over ground, over land. Yes, but we crossed the North Sea, as I mentioned, 23 times. There were a number, and still are, of B-17s on the bottom of the English Channel. This when I came home, I put it on and was showing it to my dad, and I think this was the birth of the aerosol container. I really do. We didn't have any hairsprays or underarm deodorants. We had a CO2 cylinder. That's what was in here. And we would pull these handles here, there's one on either side, and that would automatically fill up the Mae West. The only thing they told us is don't pull it up high if you had to bail out, which we didn't, because it would inflate and you could hit the water and break your back. Try to do it just before you hit the water. Now, what if the CO2 cylinder did not work? Then, just like a balloon, you'd unscrew this and blow it up by hand. We also had a pack of dye in here. I took that out years ago, and it was red dye. As soon as the guy hit the water, pardon me, the dye would show up, and the British had air-sea rescue ships or boats, and they could see and pick up the guys. I was told you couldn't stay in the English Channel probably more than 15 minutes because you would get hypothermia. The water was so cold. After the Mae West, of course, where are you? Here you are, is the helmet. And by the way, this is not a replica. This is unbelievably 76 years old, maybe a little longer even. And this leather is still as pliable as ever. They gave us good equipment. These are the earphones in case I wanted to talk to one of the people on the plane. This plugged in. That's how we communicated. But how did I communicate? Well, if I can't find it, I couldn't communicate. Here we are. This is known as a throat mic, and it went right here on the Adam's apple. We were pretty good even way back then. And if I would say nose to tail over, and then I'd release my control, and then he could talk to me this way. If we couldn't communicate, we were in trouble, because you had to be able to talk, even though they did not want a lot of chatter and so forth on the plane. As I was saying, these are the goggles that we would put on over the helmet. Why? Up at altitude, the sun's rays are so bright. If we didn't have this, you wouldn't be able to see. And in here are different lenses that I could use depending on the sun's rays. This thing is really old, and a little side note, this was made by Polaroid, the Polaroid company who makes cameras. But every guy would have his pair of goggles, okay? The next thing that we had, and most kids in school laugh when they see this, and I said, don't laugh. This was our insurance policy. And that's our oxygen mask. We would put this on anywhere between 10 and 12,000 feet altitude. And one of my jobs was to make an oxygen check every 5 minutes when we were being shot at. Why? Because every position had their oxygen tank. And flak, which is German 88 millimeter cannon shells, if it hit a guy's oxygen system, he might not even know it. He'd go to sleep. It's called anoxia, and he'd be brain dead, just like that. And many times, the fear, I believe, and all, because you're sweating, I think it's come fear, and the sweat turns to ice, and I'd unhook, knock the ice out, and put my mask back on. And I wasn't the only one to do that, though. Everybody did it. Okay. There is no oxygen after 18,000 feet. So that's why they wanted us to put it on at 10 or 12, because gradually it's less and less and less. And we usually we bombed anywhere around 20,000 feet. We also had heated suits because it was 60 below zero outside the airplane, still is, and in our plane it was 20 to 30 below. What a lot of people don't realize, especially young people, is that these planes were not pressurized like your airlines today. The first pressurized airplane was the B-29 Super Fortress in the Pacific Theater, the one that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And this, as I say, was very, very cold. We had to wear gloves because if you dared touch the shells or the gun up there, it'd peel skin right off your hands. There were a number of guys that had to have fingers amputated because they froze. I wanted to mention before that the parachute that we have is here, totally different from the parachutes that they have today. This was a huge round parachute. Why do I have a slot? Because we were shot down our first mission and we asked the pilot if we could cut open a parachute. The ball turret gunner, and this is gospel, took most of it and sent it home to his girlfriend to make a wedding dress. And that's a fact. But I got this, and it's a good piece, and it's silk. To make sure the parachute came out because when you're bailing out, you pull that red handle. This is called a pilot chute. And all it is a spring. And that spring pulls the chute out. It's a safety feature, that's all. And all it is a spring, and I happen to get that. We all grabbed what we could at the time. I have a little kind of side thing. If you had a parachute and it didn't work, they were really good to us. They said we could bring it back and they'd give us a new one. I hear laughter. One other thing. I should take my hat off and let you all know that I have a crew cut. Only the crew bailed out. Got to put a little levity into this. I don't want it to get too serious. Okay, now if we had to bail out, what could they do for us? Think about it. 25,000 feet, you're over Germany, not knowing what's going to be down there when you got down there, except Germans with submachine guns. We carried 45s. 45s, and I remember when I got home, besides all this, I turned the 45 in, and my dad liked to hunt, and he almost hung me up for turning it in. He wanted it. But this is called an escape kit. And think about it, they can't give you a suitcase or nothing. And this carried bouillon cubes, water purification tablets, matches. I traded somebody, that's a pair of German wings with the swastika. This I dug out of our waste, and that's a piece of flak. That's a German 88 millimeter cannon shell, which is not small, it's huge. But when it explodes hypothetically into 150 pieces, 200, no rhyme or reason. But if that little piece hit you right here, you'd be gone. So anyway, that is the equipment that we had. And you'll have to bear with me here. I mentioned the chocolate ration, the bouillon cubes, the malted milks, the dextrose, benzedrine, aspirin, halazon tablets. They gave us what they could, and that's about it. I want to mention a mission and how we went about it, but I'm going to do that in a few moments. When the war ended, or was close to ending, as you know or don't know, it ended May 8th. Well, the Germans were occupying the Netherlands. They were still there. They knew the war was over, but there was nothing they could do but like a couple kids fighting, and one kid beats the other kid up, and the other one walks away and throws rocks at them. That's what they did. They blew out all the dikes in Amsterdam and The Hague, and the Dutch people were dying, believe it or not, at 5,000 a week. They had no food. They were eating tulip bulbs to stay alive. And again, Churchill and Eisenhower and that decided to put plywood floors in the Bombay in B-17s and English Lancaster bombers. Then we loaded it, or they loaded it, with K rations. And instead of flying at 25,000 or 20,000, we came in at 200 to 300 feet. Can you imagine many, many big bombers coming in at 200 to 300 feet? They didn't have steer over there, they had cattle. And I still remember cattle stampeding. I mean, the noise, and I'm sure the people had curdled milk for a week or so. But we dropped, are you ready for this, 111,000 tons of K rations and food. Not just me, the B-17s and the Lancasters. There were 5 Mercy missions. I flew 3 of them. And we dropped in different spots. The Germans were down there. They said they wouldn't fire at us. They didn't fire at us because at 200 feet, they can fire at you. But they didn't fire. And when I got home and was doing just about what I'm doing now with my dad, I told him it was such a beautiful way to end the war. I was doing something good. I wasn't killing, I was saving lives. The Dutch people had written on rooftops in flowers, "God bless you boys." I mean, it was very, very emotional. And we were very thankful. When I talk in schools, I tell kids, I just wished I could get a B-17 out in the parking lot. That way you could hear those lovely engines and you would know why I am so moved every time I hear one. But to give you an idea, it kind of sounds like this. We'll hear the pilot in a minute. Warming up, getting ready to take off. Here we go. You'll hear the guns in a minute. That's about as close as I can get to combat. This was given to me by my 3 younger children many, many years ago. And when I hit that button, you'd be amazed. Some of these kids, they can't believe it. How did you get that in here? Anyway, I want to give you a few examples of what happened during our missions. When flak was fired, the only way I can tell you, it sounded like gravel when you drove your car over a gravel road. It's pieces of flak, which is metal. And of course, you're very lucky if you don't get hit by it. We had holes in our plane on about half our missions. The most we ever had were over 20 on our first mission when we were shot down. The flak blew out 2 of our engines. They were on fire. And of course, you don't stay up on 2 engines. We didn't go like this, but we went like that. And we crashed outside of a town called St. Troiden, Belgium. A little side note that is a little deja vu, if I may. When my wife and I went back to England in 1984, we were touring Europe also. And in Paris, a couple of the guys were asking me about a mission because they knew that I had flown. And they said, "Where is St. Troiden, Belgium?" I said, "I don't know." And they said, "Why don't you ask Albert, our bus driver? He's from Belgium." So I called him over and he came over. Try to put yourself in this. And he said, "What do you want, bud?" I said, "Where's St. Troiden? Why do you want to know?" And I told him. He started to get tears in his eyes. He said, "That's my hometown." And I said, "What happened?" I said, "We were picked up by a truck and taken to a schoolhouse." He says to me, "Bud, that's what my dad did. My father might have picked you up. We'll never know." But it was, pretty emotional. And anyway, we had half about our missions with flak. Our 14th mission, we were attacked by the German Me-262 jet. Again, God was with us. The guy in front, part of his tail disintegrated. He stayed up, fortunately. But the guy on our right wing got hit bad. I couldn't see it because it was like this. The tail gunner could, though. And they blew up and all 10 guys died. And that's how fast it is. Very scary. We came back from Berlin on our 13th mission. And just like when you get in your car, and I'm guilty of it, I don't put on my safety belt. Well, guys took their parachutes and just threw them in a corner. Coming over the English Channel, they let down to about 200 feet because there's no turbulence. It's very smooth. And one B-17 came over another, and this one chewed the nose off of this one. The navigator and Bombardier both drowned. The props from this one cut this guy right in half, and they all were killed. And needless to say, we got out, we were pretty shook up, but actually we were very lucky. A regular mission, we usually got up at 2 or 3 in the morning, depending on where we're going, and usually 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours in the air. That's a long time. Why so long? Because it took a long time after you took off to form with the other planes. You're still over England, and now you form with other groups. There were times when 800 to 1,000 planes went over Berlin. If you can imagine that happening to St. Louis or Chicago. And then, of course, we'd have breakfast first, then we'd go to briefing, and they tell you the target for the day is, and you'd moan. And we'd get dressed up in our various flight. This is like a summer flight suit. And put our guns in their positions. We would take off by squadron and so forth. When we came back, we would have interrogation, meaning and it was tough sometimes. We had to sit at a table, and they wanted to know, did you hit the target? There were camera ships on every squadron, I believe, that took strike photos, similar to some of the ones I have. And after the interrogation, you take a cold shower if you could, and I wrote home to Mom and Dad. I was a very homesick kid. I wrote every day, but I was very fortunate that God spared me, and as I said, that it happened 76 years ago, it kind of blows my mind. When I was 70 years old, and I always like to end my talks with this, my younger son, who lives in St. Louis, decided to write his dad a poem. And if you will, I'd like to read it to you. "'Twas 50 years ago this year, our country knew war's end was near. So many men had lost their lives. With what results? Their parents' cries. And yet there were some young men who made it through. Playing their part, in the air they flew. Some dropped soldiers by their parachutes hanging, those are paratroopers. Others were escorts, their 50 millimeters banging. But there were none so valiant," he's a little prejudiced, "as the 452nd, flying hundreds and hundreds of missions towards targets which beckoned. We are impenetrable, no force can impose, but the bombs kept on dropping from a switch in the nose. No more railroad yards or industrial plants or strategic headquarters. All those fine young men were simply following orders. One of those men, not much more than a kid, left Chicago and then Texas, bound for England he did. The locale where he stayed, a base named Deep and Green, introduced him to death, the B-17. There were missions to Deutschland, Dusseldorf, Berlin. Hundreds of bombs were released just by him. 'Twas an unpleasant duty, yet it had to be done, and with hindsight we see, helped the war to be won. The missions continued, the odds were not quite right. Enemy flak from below, countless hours in flight. Fatigue would set in. The chill was unnerving, but they'd stick to their plan and their mission unswerving. And when all of those bombs had been dropped, their load became light. Oh, the white cliffs of Dover, such a welcoming sight. Over and over, this true tale goes. Flying fortresses battled, defeating all foes. Yet many men died as they flew through the air, their lives lost not in vain, for in victory they share. Release of the captives, liberation for all, who was squelched by the menace of a coward so small, Hitler. And that kid from Chicago, who went to war quite naive, he returned as a man, a hero to me. He and his crew fought for freedom to end tyranny, and when they came back home, They were sure something to see. Their role in VE Day, now 50 years past, is a part of our history which always will last. Thank you, Dad. And I thank you for listening.